I understand that this might be a lot of information really compacted into these three kind of buckets. But just to kind of, before we go into jurisdiction, I feel a couple of questions that summarize what we've been trying to achieve with, say, sources and interpretation. I think the question for sources is, where does the law come from? And what does the law internally think is legally valid and is the law, right? So you have the law, which is kind of an insular system of knowledge production. And then you have something that's outside, which may or may not penetrate into the law as is. The second with interpretation is, now that we have a set of rules, how does the law understand the law itself, right? And who are the actors who determine what that understanding is, whether it's governance bodies or whether it's the judiciary or citizens. So there are different kind of actors at play who both make the law as well as interpret the law. Another important component when you're reading the law is something you'll often encounter, which is jurisdiction. Jurisdiction asks the question of, now that we have a set of rules and it's interpreted in a certain way, where does it apply, right? So one way to look at it is territoriality, right? So a law which is made in the state boundaries, the nation state boundaries of India is applicable only in India. It may have persuasive value or it may inspire constitution making, for instance, in other countries, like Nepal's constitution derives a lot of its values from the Indian constitution. But I can't go to a court in Nepal and say you're in violation of the Indian constitution. So a very clear territorial impact. The second way of understanding jurisdiction apart from territoriality and application of the law is who can apply the law, who can implement the law. Now, if you look at the Indian context, the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change has a lot of jurisdiction in deciding how, say, the Forest Conservation Act or the Environment Protection Act gets implemented. Why does that become important? We have to go back to the sources question of subordinate legislation, because it's these institutional actors who get to decide how the law gets implemented. And so it becomes important when you're reading a law and you look at the rules, you start to see, okay, what are the bodies that are getting created? If you look at the Forest Rights Act, you'll see that the Gram Sabha enjoys a lot of power, but there is a three-tier structure. So the law is often creating a governance kind of matrix. And within that, it's also creating what we call jurisdiction of who gets to decide how the law is applied. And this goes back to the other point, which is point number 3, which is who gets to make the rules. So the statute will decide who is the executive authority to implement the law, and then they get to decide how to do it. It's a very logical argument of convenience, right? Because if X ministry has to implement legislation Y, they know how much resources they have, they know what kind of institutional architecture they have, and they sort of have the best know-how of how to implement it. So there's always a little bit of deference or surrendering of rulemaking power to the executive to decide how to implement it. But I think in the context of environmental law, it's also important to understand that the way the law applies is also quite specific to ecosystems. And it's unfortunate that the way the law imagines ecosystems is not relational, or it's not based on interconnections, but it's quite siloed. So you'll have laws applying to forests. Biodiversity law is a bit different. It tends to encompass a more interconnected world, but you'll have coastal regulation, which applies only to the coasts. So very often looking at the law and ecosystem, it becomes one way of looking at jurisdiction. And then Shrishti is going to take you through this a bit more carefully. But jurisdiction is also about what is the venue in which you can file a legal conflict? So for instance, if say somebody is in violation of the Forest Rights Act, or somebody is in violation of the National Environment Protection Policy, and you decide that you want to go to court, which is the right court to go to, at what level, who has writ jurisdiction, who has the ability to hear the legal conflict and deliberate and interpret and decide upon it. So that's also jurisdiction. Sometimes the law itself will have a grievance redressal mechanism. So sometimes you don't even have to go to court. So if you look at the Philippines, for example, a lot of environmental law is decided in administrative tribunals themselves. The idea of going to court is not as heavy as it is in the Indian context. We went through the question about jurisdiction as nation states, but I think with environmental law, you encounter another problem about jurisdiction, which is that environmental harm doesn't stick to nation state boundaries, right? So if there's an oil spill, say something that happens off the coast of the Mediterranean, it impacts a lot of countries. And that impact, for it to be kind of thrown into the realm of law and asking the law to hold somebody accountable, it requires you to move beyond the nation state ideas. And this is where international law comes into play. We've not really focused too much on international law here. And that's because we've sort of tried to restrict it because it complicates matters a little bit. But just to understand that if there is a transboundary or cross-boundary impact issue, usually international legal norms become one way to settle it. Or if there are multilateral or bilateral environmental agreements, say for instance, the Indus Treaty, right, between India and Pakistan, becomes one way to decide how these disputes get negotiated. Just to quickly kind of conclude with the transboundary and cross-boundary issue, there are general principles of international environmental law that govern this question of jurisdiction. And when you have time, you should read the famous sort of train smelter case. In that, what they decided was that no state should commit any harm which is going to impact another state. And this is customary international law, which means that even if it's not explicitly mentioned in a treaty, it still is a valid, principle to adjudicate over. So just to conclude, there are certain, not just the idea of no harm, but also that when one decides, let's look at the India-Bhutan situation, right? So India is kind of constructing multiple hydroelectric dams across Bhutan. And much of Bhutan's GDP is actually coming from India through foreign aid. And when you look at Bhutan's environmental law, it actually states that India, as it's doing this, has to undergo an environmental impact assessment process. Very often, India has been found to be in violation of that. Not much is written about it, but this is what's actually been happening on the ground. And the way in which Bhutan has retaliated or has been attempting to retaliate, against this domestic legal violation is the principle of no harm. That India, as it's trying to kind of fulfill its needs of energy security and all of it, cannot commit a harm on another jurisdiction or nation state boundary. So that's one way to look at it. The other is climate change, which is a whole other gamut. But just to be mindful that every country contributes to a certain extent to an environmental harm, and its experience is felt across nation state boundaries. So how does one hold accountability and attribution in the context of law and jurisdiction? So I'm going to stop with that. So over to Shrishti to kind of take you through a bit about the courts and administrative authorities.
Okay. So I think we should move to the next slide then. Thanks, Arpita. Yeah. So I think I just want to focus. I know that we may probably have time to just look at the NGT Act and jurisdiction under the NGT Act, and also maybe briefly touch upon the functions writ courts play and other kinds of jurisdictions that these courts also exercise. So it's going to be a lot of information, I know. Let me just jump into how the National Green Tribunal Act is structured. So there are three kinds of jurisdictions that the NGT holds. The first is under Section 14. So where it has jurisdiction over all civil cases where a substantial question relating to the environment So we've just read that. Arising out of the enactments mentioned in Schedule 1 is concerned, right? So you have to show that there's a substantial question relating to the environment that has arisen, and it has arisen out of the enactments specified in Schedule 1. Then there is Section 15, right, which talks about relief, compensation, and restitution. And this Section 15 is also very interestingly worded. Okay, so it says that the tribunal may provide relief and compensation to victims of pollution and other environmental damage arising under the enactment specified in Schedule 1. So you again see that linkage with Schedule 1, including an accident occurring while handling any hazardous substance. Then you have B, which is for restitution of property damaged, and C, for restitution of the environment for such area or areas as the tribunal may think fit. Now, when you read this provision, do you think that when we're talking about provision B and C, it contains that limitation, that connection to Schedule 1 that is mentioned in A? And that's a very interesting question, again, of interpretation. And the court actually did answer it and and then the Supreme Court found in one particular case that no, B and C are actually freestanding, because we want to interpret this legislation as broadly as possible so that limitation of Schedule 1 isn't there in B and C. And then obviously you have, so what you can file original applications before the NGT under these two provisions. And then you have the appellate jurisdiction of the NGT, where a person was aggrieved by, now there's a host of orders that is mentioned here. This includes, so the most notable would be an environmental clearance or a forest clearance. So these, so Section 16 sort of lays out the orders or decisions made by authorities that can be appealed before the NGT. So this would be a first appeal that you'd file before the NGT, right? And when you're reading these jurisdiction clauses, it's also important to see the limitation clause contained there. So the limitation clause in the case of an application under Section 14 is wait a second, period of 6 months, right? And then there's a time that you can exceed. So if you show cause, you can allow it to be filed within a further period of 60 days. But in the case of an application under Section 15, the period is much larger. It is a period of 5 years. So the limitation clause depends on the provision under which you're approaching the court. So I don't want to spend too much time on this granularity, but these are the different kinds of jurisdictions that the NGT, these are the different kind of proceedings the NGT can entertain. If you go to the next slide. Again, in the case of environmental litigation, one question that comes up is the writ courts still have a role, because the NGT is a tribunal, and it has been argued by at different quarters that its powers are limited by the statute that gives it power. So unlike it doesn't really have the power to strike down rules on notifications. Now, when this question is still being resolved, there've been judgments one way or the other, but the question still hasn't been conclusively decided. But what litigants I'm observing are doing now are that they prefer to go to the writ courts, and because these courts clearly have the power to strike down rules and notifications. And in this context, it's important to know what the scope of the writ jurisdiction of high courts is and what the writ jurisdiction of the Supreme Court is. So the Supreme Court has a larger, obviously, territorial jurisdiction, because the High Court exercises its jurisdiction within the territory where, say, the cause of action arose, or say the seat of the authority against which you're seeking relief, where that is. So there are these territorial limitations for the High Court, whereas the Supreme Court has obviously writ runs across India, but the scope of the Supreme Court's writ jurisdiction is limited to cases of fundamental rights violations. So obviously in environmental cases, because of the sort of mushrooming of Article 21 to include really everything under it, any sort of environmental harm can now be related to a fundamental rights violation. But at the same time, when you have a sort of choice of which court to approach, and sometimes that boils down to considerations which are quasi-legal, right? So there is sometimes the consideration that courts that are closer to where the damage has happened, or courts that are closer to where a particular community feels there has been a violation of its rights, may be better suited to decide the claims of that community. So that's sort of also called subsidiarity, where if you're closer to the person that's affected, you'll be better able to take a decision on their rights. And another consideration could simply be that, okay, if I go before the High Court and I lose, I can go to the Supreme Court. So I have a rung of appeal. So sometimes it can be a very mundane but very important consideration. Another another issue could be where there is a multi-state cause of action. So you have petitioners who are affected across states, right? And then you feel that perhaps the Supreme Court may be the best forum for you to approach. So this is also something that we need to be aware of. Aside from what the court has power to do, what forum you approach really depends on other sets of legal and sometimes quasi-legal questions of strategy. Could we have the next slide? Yeah. So other than this, it's also, I think, during our last workshop, a lot of questions also arose about the other kinds of jurisdiction that the Supreme Court has. So I think I won't get too much into the granularity of it again, but the Supreme Court has the power to hear appeals from the NGT. So that's again one place where one site of environmental litigation in the Supreme Court, other than cases where it's exercising its jurisdiction. There are other times where it hears what are called special leave petitions. So these aren't appeals, but these are proceedings that you file saying, give me leave to appeal, and this is why I have a good case. So these are the questions of law that are involved. So usually if the High Court has denied you relief in an environmental litigation, this is where you'd go before the Supreme Court. And another kind of jurisdiction that's relevant for us is the suo motu jurisdiction that writ courts have, that they've exercised sometimes, and it's also been critiqued as a sort of containing dangerous procedural open-endedness that sort of excludes those affected by the Supreme Court's decisions from being heard before the Supreme Court. So that that is an important jurisdiction that the Supreme Court has. And the NGT has also been exercising suo motu jurisdiction. And that's an interesting question that we may want to ask ourselves, where it's deriving the power to do so. Because are we then saying that the NGT will have powers that sort of go beyond the scope of what the statute says? So that's just and that question again hasn't been resolved yet. So could you go to the next slide?
What we've tried to do with the workshop so far is, of course, give you an introduction to, the sources and all of it, but also within the law itself, there is a distinction between the principles and the procedure. So the procedure is very often, again, in the realm of rules and how things get implemented. But what's important about procedural laws, like how the law gets implemented, which is defined within the rules, is it gives you avenues as citizens to participate in the decision-making process. To give you an example of those in the Indian context, the environmental impact assessment has the public hearing provision, right? And similarly, you have the consent provision within the Forest Rights Act. Now, these are procedural legal avenues. Now, why the distinction and why it becomes important? So if a particular decision is arrived at by an executive authority, say the granting of an environmental clearance or the granting of a forest clearance, by skipping this step of public participation, it then doesn't necessarily remain legally valid. It's a bit of a contentious, again, process, because the way the law understands it within the law is either that it's not legally valid because it hasn't followed what they call due process, which is to say that if there are step 1, 2, 3, 4, it's gone through step 1, 2, 3, 4. There might be exceptions, right? And a lot of common law legal systems thrive on exceptions to procedure. Why? Because executive authorities in the context of the environment need flexibility. They need to be able to make quick decisions. So that's why procedural law starts to be viewed as a hurdle. So you might have seen environmental clearance is such a hurdle for businesses, et cetera, et cetera. Why is that? Because there are certain steps that have to be met. Now, with the exceptions, what happens is either they bypass these processes with certain reasonable interpretations, or it's arbitrary. When I say arbitrary, it means that they've just not done it because there isn't a reasonable enough excuse. But for even understanding whether it is a reasonable exception or it's arbitrary, you have to go to the courts. And that is one of the biggest challenges with environmental law, right? Every time the executive fails or there is regulatory failure, you end up going to courts. Whereas public participation can be quite a nice and easy check and balance process, doesn't get implemented. And this is just not an example, that's restricted to India. It's across. Whether you look at most developing countries across Latin America, Africa, or Southeast Asia, this is a challenge. But I would suggest that you look at the Aarhus Convention. I can send you the link to it. It has what I think are some of the best examples of what are procedural rights. So on the one hand, you have procedural law, which defines the process. Then you have procedural rights, which is right to be part of that process, right? To be part of the process, what do you need? You need access to information. You need to be able to participate, like validly participate, to be heard in the decision-making process. And then you need to be able to access justice or remedies if they don't listen to you. So that, I think, in the Aarhus Convention and even the ESPO Convention, which has been adopted in Latin America, are good examples of how these standards of coming together for rights and law. So I just want to conclude with that. And the reason we thought that this becomes important is because environmental law, in some sense, having now worked on it for a good decade, lies in subordinate legislation, procedural law, and judicial pronouncements. The statute is there and it is an important source, but the way in which it constantly gets used and reused is in sort of these three areas.